Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information discussed regarding legal frameworks, historical trends, and social statistics does not constitute professional legal, financial, or psychological advice. Divorce laws vary significantly by state and jurisdiction, and individual circumstances require the guidance of qualified professionals. We strongly encourage all viewers to conduct their own due diligence and consult with a licensed attorney or certified counselor before making any life-altering decisions. Imagine standing in a courtroom in 1955. To get a divorce, you don't just need a reason. You need a villain. You have to prove with tangible evidence that your spouse committed adultery, abandoned you, or engaged in extreme physical cruelty. Without a smoking gun, you are legally bound to that person until death. Now fast forward to the present day. You see a trending post on social media of a couple clashing champagne glasses in front of a courthouse with the caption, "Happily divorced." In the span of a single human lifetime, the American perception of divorce has undergone a tectonic shift, moving from a mark of permanent social exile to a celebrated act of self-remediation. But here is the paradox that most people miss. While we talk about divorce more than ever, the actual rate of divorce in the United States has been quietly declining for nearly 2 decades. Why does it feel like society is falling apart when the data suggests we are actually more stable, or perhaps just more selective than our parents were? In this deep dive masterclass, we are pulling back the curtain on the great American divorce. We are going to explore how we moved from the era of divorce colonies to the rise of conscious uncoupling, and why your understanding of the 50% statistic is likely based on a fundamental mathematical misunderstanding. To understand where we are, we must first look at the historical architecture of shame that defined the American family for over a century. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, divorce was a luxury for the rich and a scandal for the poor. Because most states had incredibly restrictive laws, a divorce industry emerged in unlikely places. Take, for example, the divorce colonies of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. In the 1890s, South Dakota had a residency requirement of only 3 months to file for divorce, compared to years in states like New York. This created a migratory pattern where wealthy socialites would board trains, move into South Dakota hotels for 90 days, and wait for their freedom. The local economy thrived on it. This was the first time the public perception of divorce collided with commercial interests. The media at the time portrayed these people as moral fugitives, yet the existence of these colonies proved there was a desperate, pent-up demand for an exit strategy from the traditional nuclear family. The perception of divorce truly began to shatter and reform during the no-fault revolution of the 1960s and 70s. Before 1969, if a couple simply fell out of love, they were stuck. This led to a surreal era of staged evidence. Couples who both wanted out would hire private investigators and actors to take photos of one spouse in a hotel room with another person, even if nothing happened, just to satisfy the court's requirement for fault. It was a legal theater that everyone participated in but no one respected. When Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, signed the Family Law Act of 1969, he effectively ended this charade. This law introduced irreconcilable differences as a valid reason for dissolution. The floodgates opened. Between 1960 and 1980, the divorce rate more than doubled. This period is critical because it represents the first time the American public had to grapple with divorce not as a rare tragedy, but as a common statistical reality. The shame began to dilute simply because everyone now knew someone, a brother, a neighbor, a coworker who had gone through it. However, this spike in the 1970s and 80s birthed the most famous and perhaps most misleading statistic in American sociology. 1 out of every 2 marriages ends in divorce. While this was a potential outcome based on the trends of 1980, it is not a universal law. Historical trends show that for people marrying today, especially those with college degrees who marry after the age of 25, the divorce rate is significantly lower. Yet, the public perception remains anchored in that 50% figure. This creates a fear of failure that actually shapes modern marriage. Younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, are waiting longer to marry or opting for LAT relationships, living apart together. They aren't avoiding commitment, they are responding to the perceived instability they witnessed in the 80s and 90s. They are performing a version of social due diligence, attempting to divorce-proof their lives before they even say, "I do." We also have to examine the radical shift in the economic perception of the family unit. In the mid-20th century, divorce was often viewed through the lens of economic catastrophe, particularly for women who were largely excluded from the workforce. The public perception was that a divorced woman was a broken ward of the state or her parents. As women entered the workforce in massive numbers during the 70s and 80s, the necessity of marriage changed. Case studies from this era show that as women gained financial independence, their willingness to tolerate unhappy or abusive marriages increased. Divorce shifted from being a failure of the home to being an assertion of autonomy. This economic shift fundamentally altered the moral narrative. It was no longer just about breaking a vow, it was about reclaiming a life. This brings us to the modern phenomenon of the gray divorce. While divorce rates are falling among younger people, they are doubling for those over the age of 50. This is a massive shift in public perception. Historically, if you reached 25 years of marriage, you were considered safe. Today, the perception is that 50 is the new 30. With increased life expectancy, a 55-year-old realizes they may have another 30 or 40 years of active life ahead of them. The societal pressure to stick it out for the sake of appearances has evaporated. We see this in high-profile case studies like the dissolutions of long-term marriages in the public eye, which signal to the average American that it is never too late to pivot. But what does this mean for the average person watching today? This documentary is designed to solve the problem of narrative confusion. We are bombarded with conflicting messages. On one hand, the sanctity of marriage is touted as the bedrock of civilization. On the other, divorce parties are a billion-dollar industry. By the end of this series, you will understand the hidden mechanics of how these perceptions are manufactured, by the legal system, by the media, and by the changing nature of the American economy. We aren't just looking at why people break up, we are looking at how those breakups redefine what it means to be a successful adult in the United States today. We will move past the headlines and look at the actual data of 2026, exploring how no fault is being challenged in some states, how collaborative divorce is replacing the War of the Roses courtroom battles, and how the digital age has made our private heartbreaks a matter of public record. This is not a story of failure, it is a story of evolution. Every statistic we cite and every historical trend we analyze points toward a singular truth. The American public no longer views divorce as the end of a book, but as the start of a difficult, yet necessary, new chapter. We are going to take you through the step-by-step process of how this cultural consensus was built, who benefited from it, and what the future of the American family looks like in an era where happily ever after is increasingly being replaced by happily for now. Stay with us because as we dive into the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the divorce industrial complex, a multi-billion-dollar machine that relies on the very perceptions we've just begun to deconstruct. To understand the divorce industrial complex, you first have to realize that in the United States in 2026, divorce is no longer just a legal proceeding. It is a multi-billion-dollar ecosystem that sustains an entire class of professionals, from forensic accountants and real estate agents to specialized therapists and even high-end moving companies. When we look at the historical trends, the economic weight of a single dissolution has ballooned far beyond simple attorney fees. The average cost of a contested divorce in America now hovers between $15,000 and $30,000 per person, but that is merely the entry fee. The true complexity lies in how the public perception of these costs has shifted from a deterrent to a perceived investment in personal future stability. Imagine a couple living in a suburban neighborhood outside of Denver in 2026. Let us call them Sarah and Michael. They have been married for 14 years, own a home with a significant amount of equity, and manage a combined portfolio of 401ks, stock options, and perhaps most relevant to 2026, a shared collection of digital assets and cryptocurrency. When Sarah decides to file for divorce, she is not just hiring a lawyer, she is activating a machine. The moment that filing is public, a data-driven marketing engine kicks in. Historically, legal professionals relied on word of mouth. Today, the perception is shaped by targeted algorithms. Sarah starts seeing advertisements for divorce coaches, a profession that barely existed 20 years ago, but is now a staple of the industry. These coaches do not offer legal advice. They offer emotional logistics, helping the client navigate the bureaucratic nightmare while keeping their hourly legal costs down. This is the first gear in the industrial complex, the productization of emotional labor. Next, consider the forensic accountant. In the mid-20th century, hiding assets meant a secret bank account or a stash of cash. In 2026, the public perception of marital assets has become incredibly sophisticated. Michael might have moved marital funds into decentralized finance protocols or purchased non-fungible tokens during the marriage. The divorce industrial complex has adapted by creating a new tier of specialists who spend their days tracing blockchain transactions. These experts charge anywhere from $500 to $1,000 an hour. The case studies of modern high-net-worth divorces show that often, more money is spent fighting over the valuation of an asset than the asset itself is actually worth. This is not just a legal battle. It is a war of attrition fueled by a professional class that profits from the duration of the conflict. The real estate market is the next massive beneficiary. In 2026, the housing crisis in the United States has made the traditional path of selling the family home and both parties buying new ones almost impossible for the middle class. This has led to the rise of specialized real estate agents who focus exclusively on divorce sales. These agents are trained in mediation and conflict resolution because they are often the only ones communicating between two parties who refuse to be in the same room. We are seeing a historical trend where divorce is a primary driver of housing inventory in certain markets. The public perception has shifted from the home being a sanctuary to the home being a liquidity event. Imagine Michael and Sarah trying to navigate a nesting arrangement, where the children stay in the house and the parents rotate in and out. This requires a third property, a rental or a smaller condo, creating even more demand for the real estate industry. Then there is the psychological and wellness sector of this complex. In the 1990s, the stigma of divorce meant that people suffered in silence or sought traditional therapy. In 2026, the perception has shifted towards celebration and rebranding. We now see the rise of the divorce registry. Just as a couple registers for a toaster and linens when they marry, the modern American can now register for the items they need to rebuild their life. This is a brilliant expansion of the consumer market. Retailers have tapped into the potential outcomes of a split, marketing new furniture, kitchenware, and even travel packages specifically to the newly single. The message is clear. Your old life is a product that has reached its expiration date, and your new life can be purchased. But we must also look at the digital infrastructure. In 2026, apps like Our Family Wizard or Talking Parents have become court-mandated in many jurisdictions. These platforms charge subscription fees to facilitate communication between ex-spouses. While they serve a vital purpose in reducing high-conflict interactions, they also represent the permanent monetization of a failed relationship. The public perception of co-parenting has been digitized and outsourced to a software-as-a-service model. Every text message, every calendar update, and every reimbursement request for a child's soccer cleats is tracked, logged, and potentially used as evidence in a future hearing. The legal system has effectively integrated these private companies into the fabric of American family law. We also have to discuss the wealth gap inherent in this system. The divorce industrial complex serves a specific demographic. For the wealthy, it is a sophisticated liquidation process. For the middle class, it is often a path to significant debt. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show that a significant portion of personal bankruptcies in the United States are tied directly to the cumulative costs of a protracted legal battle. Yet, the public perception remains focused on the celebrity version of divorce, the clean breaks and the massive settlements. The reality for the average person is a step-by-step erosion of their net worth. The system is designed to be adversarial because conflict generates billable hours. If Sarah and Michael agree on everything, the industry makes a few $1,000s. If they disagree on everything, the industry makes a few $100,000. This leads to a fascinating psychological phenomenon: the sunk cost fallacy in the American courtroom. Once a couple has spent $50,000 on experts, they feel they cannot settle for anything less than a total victory to justify the expense. They are no longer fighting for the assets, they are fighting to validate the cost of the fight. This cycle is what keeps the industrial complex thriving. It relies on the public perception that justice is a commodity that can be bought if you just hire the right expert, the right coach, or the right forensic investigator. As we look at the landscape of 2026, we see that the divorce industrial complex has become so efficient that it has begun to influence how people enter into marriages. The rise of the prenup is no longer just for the 1%. It is now perceived as a basic financial planning tool for anyone with a student loan or a modest retirement account. We are witnessing the pre-commodification of the end of a relationship before it even begins. But what happens when the cameras are turned off and the lawyers go home? What is the actual human cost of this multi-billion-dollar machine? Does this industrialization of heartbreak actually lead to better outcomes for the families involved? Or is it merely a more efficient way to redistribute wealth from the household to the professional class? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the psychological fallout of this system, specifically the evolving perception of the children caught in the middle. We will examine how the 2026 concept of the resilient child is being challenged by new longitudinal data, and why the way we talk about the impact of divorce on the next generation might be the biggest misconception of all. We are moving from the boardroom and the courtroom into the living room, where the true long-term consequences of these shifts are finally being felt. Stay with us as we uncover the hidden reality of the children of the divorce industrial complex. The transition from the courtroom to the living room is where the abstract numbers of the divorce industrial complex become concrete reality. In the United States of 2026, the public perception of the child of divorce has moved through three distinct phases. Historically, in the 1950s and 60s, the child was viewed as a victim of a broken home, a term that carried a heavy weight of sociological failure. By the 1990s, the narrative shifted toward the concept of the resilient child, a psychological framework suggesting that kids are adaptable and that a healthy divorce is better than a high-conflict marriage. Today, in 2026, we are entering a third phase, the era of the institutionalized child. This is a child whose daily life is no longer governed solely by parental intuition, but by a set of court-ordered protocols, digital tracking apps, and professional intermediaries. Imagine a 10-year-old named Leo living in a major American metropolitan area in 2026. Leo does not have one home. He has a primary residence and a secondary residence. This linguistic shift is the first step in the professionalization of his childhood. Public perception has largely moved away from the word custody because it implies ownership and incarceration. Instead, the legal system and the public now use the term parenting time. While this sounds more equitable for Leo, it means his life is governed by a complex, color-coded Google Calendar that is often monitored by a third-party professional known as a parenting coordinator. A parenting coordinator is a role that has seen a significant historical trend toward becoming a standard feature in middle to high-income American divorces. This person is usually a lawyer or a social worker with a direct line to the judge. Imagine if every time your parents had an argument about whether you could stay up late or what brand of shoes you should wear, a billable professional had to intervene to make the final decision. For Leo, this means his household rules are not organic, they are litigated. The potential outcomes of this environment are only now being studied in long-term longitudinal data. While the 1990s resilience narrative suggested Leo would simply bounce back, the 2026 data suggests a phenomenon called emotional hypervigilance. Leo becomes an expert at reading the room, not because he is naturally empathetic, but because his stability depends on his ability to navigate the unspoken tensions between two different domestic ecosystems. We must also look at the material reality of the split household. In 2026, the consumer market has fully optimized for the two-home child. This has created a step-by-step expansion of the child's material footprint. Step 1 is the duplication of essentials. Leo has 2 sets of clothes, 2 gaming consoles, and 2 sets of school supplies. Step 2 is the digital tether. Because the parents may not speak directly, Leo's iPad becomes the primary portal for communication. However, this device is often equipped with monitoring software that both parents can access. The public perception is that this keeps the child safe and connected, but the case studies of 2026 show it often leads to a sense of surveillance. Leo feels that he can never truly be off the clock. His movements, his screen time, and even his messages are data points in a potential future court filing. The economic impact on the child is also profound. In the 20th century, the financial cost of divorce was often seen as a one-time hit to the family savings. In 2026, the cost is a recurring monthly subscription. There are fees for the communication apps like Our Family Wizard, fees for the mandatory co-parenting classes that many states now require, and the ongoing costs of 2 households that must both be equipped to support a child's full-time needs. For many American families, this leads to what sociologists call the thinning of the middle class. 2 parents who were comfortably middle class together often find themselves hovering near the poverty line when forced to maintain 2 separate, child-ready residences. The public perception often ignores this financial erosion, focusing instead on the freedom the parents have gained. Furthermore, we have to address the shift in the school's role. In 2026, the American school system has become a frontline mediator in the divorce industrial complex. Teachers are now routinely trained on how to handle split household logistics, who is allowed to pick up the child on which day, which parent gets the original report card, and how to conduct 2 separate parent-teacher conferences to avoid a physical confrontation in the hallway. This institutionalization of the divorce means that Leo never leaves the context of his parents' separation. It is present in his classroom, his extracurricular activities, and his digital life. Historical trends show that we used to worry about the social stigma of divorce for children. Today, that stigma is almost entirely gone because the experience is so common. However, it has been replaced by a logistical burden that is unique to the 21st century. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 indicate that children in these high-functioning, multi-professional divorces often report a sense of homelessness, even when they have 2 homes. The perception of the child as a consultant in their own life is a double-edged sword. While children are now given more of a voice in court proceedings through an attorney for the child or a guardian ad litem, this also forces them to make adult-level decisions before they are emotionally ready. Imagine being asked by a stranger in a suit to rank your preference for spending time with your mother or your father, knowing that your answer will be written into a legal document that governs the next 8 years of your life. This leads us to the evolution of the holiday and the vacation. In the modern American perception, the traditional family holiday has been replaced by the holiday schedule. This is a rigid, rotating system that ensures mathematical fairness, but often ignores the emotional needs of the participants. The 2026 trend towards celebratory divorce or conscious uncoupling often masks the underlying stress of these transitions. Publicly, the parents may post photos of a joint Thanksgiving dinner to show their maturity, but the data of the divorce industrial complex shows that these arrangements often require months of negotiation and thousands of dollars in professional mediation to achieve. As we look deeper into the reality of the children, we see that the 2026 American public is beginning to question the resilience narrative. We are starting to see the first generation of children who were raised entirely within the digital, professionalized divorce system reaching adulthood. Their perspectives are shifting the conversation from how do we make divorce easier for the parents to what is the actual long-term psychological cost of being a project-managed child. We are seeing a potential outcome where this generation prioritizes stability over almost everything else, leading to even lower marriage rates and a more cautious approach to family formation than we have ever seen in United States history. But the psychological fallout is only half of the story. While the children are navigating the logistics of 2 homes, the parents are navigating a legal and financial system that is increasingly polarized by gendered expectations and changing economic realities. Who really pays the price when the household splits? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to dive into the gendered economics of divorce in 2026. We will examine the controversial rise of the breadwinner woman, the shifting perception of alimony in a dual-income world, and the secret financial strategies that are used to protect wealth before the first paper is ever filed. We are moving from the living room back into the counting house to see how the money really moves when love stops. Stay with us as we uncover the financial battlefield of the modern American divorce. The financial battlefield of the modern American divorce is no longer a simple division of assets. It has become a complex theater of economic warfare where the rules of engagement have been rewritten by a shifting workforce and a changing social contract. In 2026, we are witnessing the peak of a historical trend where the gendered roles of provider and dependent have been fundamentally disrupted. To understand the public perception of divorce today, we must first confront the rise of the breadwinner woman and the profound psychological and financial shockwaves this creates in the family court system. Imagine a high-stakes scenario in a city like Austin, Texas. We have a couple, let us call them Elena and Mark. Elena is a chief operating officer for a mid-sized technology firm, earning a salary of $450,000 a year, supplemented by a significant portfolio of restricted stock units. Mark is a dedicated educator who transitioned to part-time consulting to manage the majority of the household's domestic needs and their 2 children. In the mid-20th century, the financial trajectory of their divorce would have been predictable. But in 2026, the roles are reversed, and the public perception of what is fair is deeply divided. When Elena and Mark enter the legal process, the first point of friction is spousal maintenance, formerly known as alimony. Historical trends show that for decades, alimony was perceived as a lifeline for women who had been excluded from the labor market. However, in 2026, the potential outcomes for Elena involve her paying a substantial portion of her post-tax income to Mark for a duration determined by the length of their marriage. This shift has created a new demographic of divorcees who feel they are being hit with a success tax. Elena perceives the payment not as support for a partner, but as a penalty for her professional ambition. Meanwhile, the public perception often struggles to grant Mark the same empathy historically afforded to stay-at-home mothers. This gendered double standard in the counting house is one of the most volatile aspects of modern dissolution. The complexity deepens when we look at the step-by-step process of asset valuation. In 2026, the most contentious assets are often those that are the hardest to see. Case studies from this year highlight the brutal battles over unvested stock options and digital intellectual property. For Elena, her restricted stock units are not just future compensation. They are a marital asset in the eyes of the court. The legal system must determine what portion of those units was earned through effort expended during the marriage. This leads to a forensic deep dive into her employment contract, her performance reviews, and even her daily work calendar. The public perception of wealth in divorce has moved from tangible property like the family home to the abstract value of future labor. We must also examine the controversial concept of lifestyle maintenance. In 2026, American courts often utilize a standard of living analysis to determine support payments. This is not just about bread and water, it is about the frequency of luxury travel, the caliber of private education for the children, and even the maintenance of high-end vehicles. Imagine if Elena and Mark spent $50,000 a year on family vacations. In the eyes of the law, Mark may be entitled to support that allows him to continue providing that same level of experience for the children during his parenting time. This creates an economic tether that can last for years, long after the emotional bond has dissolved. The public is increasingly skeptical of this model, with many arguing that divorce should represent a clean break rather than a permanent financial subsidy of a former lifestyle. This economic tension has given rise to what professionals call the pre-filing strategy phase. In 2026, the public perception is that if you wait until you file to protect your interests, you have already lost. We see an increasing trend of individuals engaging in asset shielding, not through illegal means, but through the sophisticated use of trusts and corporate structures. This is a sociological observation of eroding trust. Before the first paper is ever served, a spouse might move personal inheritance funds into a domestic asset protection trust or restructure a business partnership to minimize the appearance of personal liquidity. These are not get-rich-quick schemes. They are defensive maneuvers in a high-stakes financial game. Furthermore, the tax implications of 2026 have fundamentally changed the math of the settlement. Ever since the federal tax code shifted the burden of spousal support from the receiver to the payer, the actual cost of a settlement has effectively increased for the high earner. This has led to a rise in the lump sum settlement. Instead of paying $10,000 a month for 5 years, Elena might offer Mark a one-time payment of $400,000, often derived from the equity in the family home or a shared brokerage account. The public perception of these buyouts is that they offer a faster path to closure, but the case studies show they often leave the lower-earning spouse vulnerable to long-term inflation and market volatility. There is also the matter of the collaborative law movement. In 2026, many wealthy Americans are opting out of the public courtroom entirely. They are using private judges and confidential mediation to keep their financial skeletons in the closet. The public perception of the messy public divorce trial is being replaced by the silent professional liquidation. This creates a two-tiered system of justice, one where the details of a middle-class family's debt are a matter of public record, and another where the wealthy can negotiate the division of millions behind closed doors. This lack of transparency has led to a growing suspicion among the general public that the system is rigged in favor of those who can afford to hide the process. The gendered economics of 2026 also reveal a fascinating trend in how we value domestic labor. While Mark may receive spousal support, the court often struggles to put a precise dollar amount on the career sacrifices he made. How do you quantify the potential outcomes of the promotions he did not take or the professional network he did not build while managing the household? This is the invisible debt of the American marriage. Public perception is slowly beginning to acknowledge that the high earner's success is often a joint venture, yet the financial settlement rarely feels like a fair dividend to either party. As we peel back the layers of the counting house, we see that the financial battlefield of divorce is a reflection of our deepest cultural anxieties about money, power, and the value of time. The shift from the breadwinner model of the 1900s to the dual income or reversed role models of 2026 has left the legal system and the public psyche in a state of constant friction. Every check written and every asset divided is a statement on what we believe a partnership is worth. But what happens when the financial battle is won or lost, and the conflict moves into the digital town square? In 2026, the way a divorce is perceived by the public is often dictated by what happens on a smartphone screen. The financial settlement is only the beginning of a much larger struggle for narrative control. In the next part of this documentary, we are going to explore the rise of the digital divorce trial. We will look at social media clauses in legal contracts, the weaponization of private text messages, and how the court of public opinion has become more influential than the court of law. We are moving from the ledgers of the accountants to the feeds of the influencers to see how your digital footprint can determine your legal destiny. Stay with us as we uncover the era of the viral divorce. The era of the viral divorce in 2026 is defined by a singular, chilling reality. Your privacy is no longer a right. It is a luxury you likely surrendered the moment you clicked "I accept" on a terms of service agreement a decade ago. In the United States today, the public perception of divorce has been fundamentally altered by the glass house of social media. We have moved from the era of private heartbreak to the era of the algorithmic trial, where the court of public opinion often reaches a verdict long before a judge has even put on their robes. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the step-by-step evolution of how our digital footprints have been weaponized, turning personal tragedies into public entertainment. Imagine a woman named Chloe living in Seattle in 2026. Chloe is a mid-tier lifestyle influencer with a dedicated following of 300,000 people who have watched her get married, buy her first home, and raise 2 children. Her brand is built on the perception of an aspirational, stable family life. When her marriage to her husband, Jackson, begins to crumble, she is faced with a terrifying economic and legal dilemma. In 2026, a divorce for someone like Chloe is not just a personal ending. It is a corporate liquidation. Her digital footprint is her primary asset, and the public perception of her character determines its value. The first point of engagement in the modern digital divorce is the social media clause. In 2026, historical trends show that nearly 60% of prenuptial and postnuptial agreements in the United States now include specific language regarding digital conduct during and after a dissolution. These are often referred to as non-disparagement or anti-shaming clauses. The potential outcomes of violating such a clause are severe. If Chloe posts a cryptic video on a Tuesday night implying that Jackson was unfaithful or emotionally distant, she could be in breach of a contract that carries a pre-negotiated financial penalty. We are seeing case studies where individuals have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars in marital settlements simply because they could not resist the urge to post a passive-aggressive story on Instagram. However, the weaponization of the digital footprint goes much deeper than public posts. We must examine the process of digital discovery. In 2026, the traditional discovery process, where lawyers exchange paper documents and bank statements, has been overshadowed by AI-driven forensic analysis of private communications. Imagine if every text message, every deleted DM, and every location data point from the last 10 years was fed into a specialized legal software. This software doesn't just look for keywords. It analyzes tone, frequency of contact, and even the sentiment of your emojis to build a narrative of marital misconduct or financial hiding. Take a case study from early 2026 involving a high-stakes custody battle in Chicago. The father's legal team used digital discovery to map out the mother's location data over a 3-year period. By cross-referencing her phone's GPS with her credit card transactions and social media check-ins, they were able to argue that she was consistently absent during critical parenting hours, despite her claims to the contrary. The public perception of this kind of surveillance has shifted. What was once seen as a creepy invasion of privacy is now viewed by many in the legal profession as due diligence. The digital trail never lies, and in 2026, it is the most powerful witness in the courtroom. Then there is the phenomenon of the leaked narrative. In the United States of 2026, we are witnessing the rise of the tactical leak. When a couple like Chloe and Jackson decide to split, the first few hours are a race to control the narrative. The public perception of who is the victim and who is the villain is often decided by which side leaks the first batch of receipts. This might be a screen recording of a heated FaceTime argument or a series of damning emails. These leaks are rarely accidental. They are often coordinated by reputation management firms that specialize in digital divorce. These firms understand that if they can swing public opinion in favor of their client, it creates immense pressure on the other party to settle quickly and quietly to avoid further reputational damage. The court of public opinion has become so influential that it is now affecting the behavior of judges and juries. While legal professionals are instructed to stick to the evidence presented in court, they are still human beings who exist in the same digital ecosystem as everyone else. The historical trends of 2026 suggest that a person who has been successfully vilified on social media faces a much harder climb in the courtroom. This is particularly true in cases involving custody or the division of high-profile businesses. The public perception of a person's character, fueled by viral clips and out-of-context screenshots, creates a bias that is nearly impossible to erase. This brings us to the rise of the digital cleanse. In 2026, a new sector of the divorce industrial complex has emerged. Firms that offer to scrub your digital past before you file for divorce. This is a step-by-step process of identifying every potential digital vulnerability, from old college photos to deleted dating app profiles, and attempting to bury them under a mountain of fresh, positive content. However, the potential outcomes of a digital cleanse are risky. If a court determines that you intentionally destroyed digital evidence, you could face sanctions that dwarf the original reputational risk. We also have to consider the psychological impact of this public shaming. In the mid-20th century, the shame of divorce was a local matter. It stayed within your church or your neighborhood. In 2026, the shame is global and permanent. For someone like Chloe, the comments section of her posts becomes a digital pillory. The public doesn't just watch the divorce. They participate in it, taking sides, analyzing her body language and demanding transparency. This creates a state of perpetual trauma, where the ending of a marriage is replayed and dissected millions of times. The perception of divorce has moved from a private transition to a spectator sport, and the participants are the gladiators. The digital era has also changed how we perceive the concept of moving on. In 1990, if you got divorced, you could move to a new city and start over with a relatively clean slate. In 2026, your divorce is a permanent part of your SEO. Anyone who searches your name for a job interview, a new date, or a business partnership will see the digital remnants of your marital collapse. This has led to a historical trend of divorcees adopting pseudonyms or completely withdrawing from public digital life, a modern form of social exile. As we look at the feeds of the influencers and the private messages of the average American, we see that the digital divorce is the ultimate expression of our loss of control. We have built a world where our most intimate failures are converted into data, and that data is used to determine our legal and social worth. But even as the digital world grows more complex, a counter-movement is beginning to take hold. There is a growing segment of the American public that is looking at this digital carnage and saying no more. In the next part of this documentary, we are going to explore the great traditionalist pivot. We will examine why a growing number of young Americans in 2026 are rejecting the digital transparency of the modern era in favor of radical privacy and a return to traditional, often religious frameworks of marriage. We will look at the rise of the covenant marriage, the return of the domestic sphere, and how the backlash against the viral divorce is creating a brand new cultural divide in the United States. Is the future of marriage a return to the past? Stay with us as we uncover the movement that is trying to take the American family off the grid. The great traditionalist pivot of 2026 did not emerge in a vacuum. It is a direct, calculated reaction to the digital exhaustion we just explored. As the American public watched the messy, algorithmic dissolution of high-profile influencers, a silent but significant portion of the population began to view radical privacy not just as a preference, but as a survival strategy. This movement is not merely a nostalgic retreat to the 1950s. It is a modern high-tech rejection of the very systems that have made divorce so public and so profitable. In this part of our masterclass, we examine how a growing segment of United States society is attempting to divorce-proof their lives by opting out of the modern marital narrative entirely. Imagine a couple named David and Hannah living in a quiet, affluent pocket of the Appalachian foothills in 2026. David is a software architect who works entirely offline for 3 days a week, and Hannah is a specialized educator who has deleted every social media account she ever owned. To their neighbors, they look like a throwback to an earlier era, but their lifestyle is a deliberate wall built against the divorce industrial complex. They represent a new cultural archetype, the off-the-grid traditionalist. Their perception of marriage is rooted in the belief that the primary catalyst for modern divorce is the constant, comparative noise of the digital world. By removing the audience, they believe they can remove the performance, and by extension, the external pressures that lead to marital collapse. This pivot is most visible in the sudden resurgence of covenant marriage. While many Americans have forgotten that this legal framework even exists, in 2026, we are seeing a historical trend of legislative pushes to expand these laws beyond their original homes in Arizona, Arkansas, and Louisiana. A covenant marriage is a step-by-step legal commitment that begins long before the wedding. It requires mandatory premarital counseling that is not just a suggestion but a statutory requirement. Most importantly, it involves a voluntary surrender of the right to a no-fault divorce. Under a covenant marriage contract, David and Hannah have agreed that they can only dissolve their union under specific, high-stakes conditions such as adultery, a felony conviction, or physical abuse. The public perception of this choice is deeply polarizing. In urban centers like New York or San Francisco, this is often viewed as a dangerous regression, a trap that removes the essential freedom of the no-fault era. However, in the communities where the pivot is taking hold, it is perceived as the ultimate form of consumer protection. The logic is simple. By making the exit door harder to open, you increase the incentive to maintain the interior of the house. Case studies from 2026 indicate that couples in covenant marriages report higher levels of initial perceived security, though the potential outcomes for those who eventually find themselves in an unhappy but legally binding union remain a subject of intense sociological debate. We must also look at the rise of the domestic anchor strategy. In the previous part, we discussed the economic warfare of dual-income divorces. The traditionalist pivot addresses this by returning to a highly specialized division of labor. This is not about the suppression of one partner, but about the creation of interdependence. In 2026, many young couples are deliberately choosing to live on a single income, even when both are highly educated. They perceive the dual-income model as a structural risk. If both partners are equally mobile and financially independent, the marriage is viewed as a choice that must be made every single day. If the roles are specialized, the marriage becomes a functional necessity. This shift in perception treats the family unit as a small private corporation where each member has a non-transferable role. This movement has also birthed a new industry, the privacy architect. These are professionals who help families take their domestic lives off the grid. Step 1 involves the scrub of all historical digital footprints. Step 2 is the implementation of home networks that utilize local-only storage, ensuring that family photos, videos, and private communications never touch a cloud server. Step 3 is the creation of a physical social circle that operates on a foundation of non-disclosure. In 2026, the perception of a successful marriage for these families is one that leaves no digital trace. If there are no photos of the anniversary dinner on Instagram, the anniversary dinner belongs entirely to the couple. They are reclaiming the sanctity of the private sphere by treating their relationship as a trade secret. Furthermore, we are seeing a fascinating historical trend in the return of the multi-generational household as a defensive measure. In the mid-20th century, the nuclear family was the ideal. In 2026, the traditionalist pivot is reintroducing grandparents and extended kin into the daily domestic operation. The public perception here is that a divorce is much harder to execute when it requires the displacement of 6 people instead of 2. The extended family acts as a built-in mediation board. When David and Hannah have a conflict, they are not looking for a divorce coach on an app. They are navigating a social structure that has a vested, multi-generational interest in their staying together. However, this pivot is creating a massive cultural chasm in the United States. We are effectively moving toward 2 different versions of marriage. On one side, you have the liquid marriage, a flexible, digital, and egalitarian union that is easy to enter and easy to exit, governed by the principles of individual happiness and no-fault laws. On the other side, you have the solid marriage, a rigid, private, and hierarchical union that is difficult to enter and nearly impossible to exit, governed by the principles of communal stability and covenant law. Your perception of which model is better is increasingly determined by your geography and your ideological silo. In 2026, the traditionalist pivot is also influencing the corporate world. We are seeing the emergence of family-first employment contracts in certain sectors, where companies provide benefits specifically designed to support single-income households or offer relocation packages that accommodate extended families. These companies perceive marital stability as a productivity asset. They believe a stable employee is a more focused employee, and they are willing to subsidize the traditionalist lifestyle to ensure it. But this movement is not without its shadows. The potential outcomes of radical privacy include a lack of accountability. If a marriage is entirely off the grid and the legal exits are blocked by covenant contracts, the victims of domestic dysfunction have fewer places to turn. The public perception of the off-the-grid family as a peaceful sanctuary is often at odds with the reality of those who find themselves trapped in the very structures they thought would protect them. The historical trends of the 19th century remind us that when divorce is impossible, the domestic sphere can become a silent prison. As we analyze this great pivot, we see that the American public is desperately searching for a middle ground that may not exist. We want the freedom of the modern era but the stability of the traditional one. We want the benefits of digital connectivity but the privacy of a pre-internet world. The tension between these two desires is what will define the next decade of American family life. But what happens when these two worlds collide? What happens when a liquid spouse marries a solid spouse? Or when the legal system is forced to mediate between a covenant contract and a no-fault reality? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the rise of artificial intelligence in the divorce process. We will examine the controversial 2026 software that claims to predict the probability of a divorce before the couple even gets engaged. We will look at AI mediators that are replacing human judges in small claims property divisions and the ethical nightmare of the predictive parenting plan. We are moving from the traditionalist hearth to the silicon chip to see if technology can solve the problems it helped create. Stay with us as we enter the era of the algorithmic altar. The algorithmic altar represents the ultimate convergence of human emotion and cold, hard data. In the United States of 2026, we have reached a point where the most intimate decisions of our lives are being filtered through neural networks designed to optimize for efficiency, fairness, and predictability. While the traditionalists we just discussed are retreating into the privacy of the past, a massive segment of the American public is moving in the opposite direction, embracing technology to manage the inherent messiness of human relationships. To understand this shift, we must look at the step-by-step integration of artificial intelligence into every phase of the marital life cycle, from the first date to the final decree. Imagine a couple named Liam and Maya living in a high-tech hub like San Jose in 2026. Before they even considered a proposal, they engaged with a service known as a marital sustainability analysis. In the early 2020s, AI was used to help people find matches. Today, it is used to predict their failure. Liam and Maya provided the software with access to 10 years of their digital history, their financial spending habits, their social media sentiment, their sleep patterns tracked via wearable devices, and even their genetic compatibility markers. The AI did not give them a blessing, it gave them a probability. It suggested that based on their historical trends of conflict resolution and financial priorities, their marriage had a 68% chance of lasting 20 years. This is the first pillar of the algorithmic altar, the datafied spouse. The public perception of compatibility has moved away from chemistry and toward data matching. In 2026, many young Americans perceive a marriage without an AI audit as an act of financial and emotional recklessness. They are looking for potential outcomes that can be quantified. If the algorithm flags a high probability of future friction over household labor or investment strategies, the couple might enter into a smart contract, a digital, self-executing prenuptial agreement that automatically adjusts based on real-time data. For example, if one spouse leaves the workforce to care for a child, the smart contract might automatically reallocate a percentage of the household's digital assets to that spouse's private wallet to ensure immediate equity. But where the AI truly takes control is when the marriage begins to fracture. In 2026, the American legal system is overwhelmed, and the public perception of the human judge is one of bias and exhaustion. This has led to the rise of the binary judge, AI-driven mediation platforms that are now the default for uncontested or mid-level contested divorces in several states. Imagine if, instead of spending 18 months in a courtroom, Liam and Maya spent 3 hours interacting with a neutral AI interface. This system, trained on millions of previous case studies and state-specific statutes, performs a mathematical division of the marital estate that is objectively fair. The step-by-step process of an AI-mediated divorce is clinical. Step 1 is the ingestion of all financial data via direct API links to banks, brokerage accounts, and crypto exchanges. There is no hiding of assets because the AI can detect anomalies in spending patterns that a human accountant might miss. Step 2 is the sentiment analysis of all communication. The AI reviews years of text messages and emails to determine if there was a historical trend of coercive control or financial abuse, which might influence the final settlement. Step 3 is the generation of the equisplit, a comprehensive proposal that balances liquid assets, real estate, and future earnings. The public perception of this process is that it removes the theater of the courtroom and replaces it with the logic of the spreadsheet. However, the most controversial element of this new reality is the predictive parenting plan. In 2026, the United States is seeing a historical trend where custody arrangements are no longer based on the subjective testimony of parents, but on the data-driven needs of the child. Imagine the AI analyzing a child's school performance, extracurricular schedules, and even biometric data from their smartwatch to determine which parent's home provides a more stable environment on specific days of the week. The AI might suggest that the child spends Tuesdays and Wednesdays with Maya because her work-from-home data shows she is more present and less stressed on those days, while weekends are better suited for Liam. This level of algorithmic intervention has created a new kind of social friction. While many perceive the AI as a way to protect children from parental conflict, others see it as a terrifying form of digital social engineering. Case studies from 2025 and 2026 show that parents are now self-optimizing their behavior to please the algorithm. They are mindful of their screen time, their tone in text messages, and their grocery shopping habits, knowing that every data point could be used by the AI to adjust their parenting time. We have moved from being parents to being data producers for a machine that decides our fitness as guardians. We must also address the emergence of the AI divorce bot, a digital assistant that lives on your phone and acts as a constant legal and emotional advisor during the dissolution process. These bots are programmed to prevent the kind of viral outbursts we discussed in the previous part. If Liam starts to type an angry, disparaging message to Maya at 2 in the morning, the AI intercepts it. It provides a warning. Sending this message has a 40% probability of negatively impacting your custody settlement. The public perception of these bots is that they act as a digital conscience, keeping the peace through the threat of future legal consequences. But there is a darker side to the algorithmic altar. AI bias is a significant concern in 2026. Because these systems are trained on historical trends, they can inadvertently perpetuate the same gender and racial biases that have plagued the human legal system for decades. If an AI sees that, historically, high-earning men have been awarded more assets in a specific jurisdiction, it may continue to suggest those outcomes as the baseline for fairness. The American public is currently caught in a debate over whether a flawed human judge with empathy is better than a flawed algorithm with none. Furthermore, the rise of AI has birthed a new professional class, the prompt engineer for family law. These are experts who know exactly how to frame a couple's data to get the most favorable outcome from the mediation software. They understand the hidden weights and balances within the code. This creates a new wealth gap. Those who can afford the best data cleaners and prompt engineers will always have a smoother divorce than those who simply let the raw data speak for itself. As we look at the silicon-driven future of the American family, we see a paradox. The very technology that was supposed to make divorce simpler and more equitable has introduced a new layer of surveillance and complexity. We are no longer just divorcing our partners. We are navigating a digital labyrinth that knows us better than we know ourselves. The public perception of divorce has shifted from a moral failure to a logistical error that can be debugged with the right software. But what happens when the data isn't enough? What happens when the conflict is so deep, so primal, and so international that no algorithm can resolve it? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the rise of global divorce tourism. We will explore how wealthy Americans in 2026 are using jurisdictional arbitrage to move their legal battles to countries with more favorable laws. We will examine the secret world of international asset protection and the high-stakes world of cross-border custody battles. We are moving from the digital cloud to the global stage to see how the elite play the game of divorce on a map with no borders. Stay with us as we uncover the world of the transnational split. The transnational split is the ultimate manifestation of legal arbitrage in 2026. While the average American family is navigating the local county courthouse, the global elite have transformed the map of the world into a strategic game board. In the United States, we have seen a significant historical trend where wealth and mobility allow individuals to bypass domestic restrictions by shopping for a legal system that favors their specific financial or parental goals. This is not just a high-stakes divorce. It is jurisdictional warfare. To understand how this works, we must look at the step-by-step process of forum shopping and how the public perception of these maneuvers has shifted from a rare outlier to a standard operating procedure for the ultramobile. Imagine a high-profile couple named Alexander and Isabella. Alexander is a venture capitalist based in Manhattan, while Isabella is a dual-citizen tech executive who frequently splits her time between London and Singapore. In 2026, their marriage is failing, but the legal battle does not start with a filing. It starts with a race. This is the race to the courtroom. In the world of transnational divorce, the first person to file in a specific jurisdiction often locks in the laws of that land. For Alexander and Isabella, the difference between filing in New York or filing in London could represent a potential outcome of tens of millions of dollars. In the United States, specifically in New York, the court follows the principle of equitable distribution. This means the court looks at what is fair, which does not always mean a 50-50 split. However, London has earned the reputation in 2026 as the divorce capital of the world because English courts traditionally lean toward an equal sharing of all assets, regardless of whose name they are in or where they were earned. If Isabella can file in London first, she may secure a significantly larger portion of the marital estate. Alexander, knowing this, might attempt to file in a jurisdiction like Dubai or certain U.S. states that are far more restrictive regarding the division of premarital wealth or business valuations. The public perception of this race is that justice is no longer about the truth of the relationship, but about the speed of the private jet and the agility of the international legal team. Beyond the race to file, we must examine the secretive world of international asset shielding. In 2026, the complexity of digital assets has made it easier than ever for the elite to move wealth across borders in ways that are nearly invisible to domestic courts. Consider a case study involving a Silicon Valley founder we will call Marcus. Marcus has spent years building a portfolio of decentralized finance assets and interests in sovereign digital zones, territories that operate under independent legal frameworks for the digital economy. When his marriage begins to dissolve, Marcus does not hide money in a shoebox. He utilizes jurisdictional arbitrage to move his capital into trusts located in the Cook Islands or Nevis, jurisdictions that do not recognize U.S. court orders for the seizure of assets. The step-by-step process of this financial fortification is chillingly efficient. Step 1 is the creation of a tiered ownership structure where Marcus owns nothing directly, but controls everything through a series of offshore entities. Step 2 is the transfer of liquid capital into non-extraditable digital repositories. Step 3 is the legal defense, where Marcus's team argues in an American court that he simply does not have the liquidity to meet a massive settlement. The public perception of this is a growing resentment. While the middle class has their bank accounts frozen and their wages garnished, the transnational elite are perceived as being above the law, playing by a set of rules that stop at the edge of the territorial sea. However, the most heart-wrenching aspect of the transnational split is the international custody battle. In 2026, the rise of the digital nomad and the global workforce has made the concept of habitual residence a legal nightmare. Imagine a couple, Elena and Thomas. Elena is a Brazilian-American architect, and Thomas is an American software engineer. They have lived in 4 different countries in the last 6 years. When they decide to separate while living in Portugal, Elena wants to take their children back to her family in Brazil, while Thomas wants them to return to the United States. This triggers the Hague Convention on the civil aspects of international child abduction. In 2026, the public perception of the Hague Convention has shifted. Once seen as a tool to prevent kidnappings, it is now often viewed as a blunt instrument that can trap parents and children in countries where they have no support system. The case studies from this year show that courts are increasingly struggling to define where a child actually lives when their entire education has been remote and their social circle is entirely online. The potential outcomes of these cases are often devastating, resulting in children being stuck in legal limbo for years while 2 different countries argue over who has the right to decide their future. Furthermore, we are seeing the emergence of divorce havens. Just as there are tax havens, certain countries in 2026 have streamlined their legal processes to attract wealthy foreigners looking for a quick and quiet exit. These jurisdictions offer digital-only proceedings, guaranteed privacy from public records, and a fixed fee model that bypasses the billable hour trap of the U.S. system. The historical trend shows a move toward the commodification of the decree itself. For a certain price, you can buy a dissolution that is recognized globally but conducted with the clinical efficiency of a corporate merger. The economic impact of this global industry is staggering. We are talking about an international legal fee market that exceeds $10 billion annually. This has created a new class of global law firms that specialize in nothing but cross-border marital conflict. These firms have offices in every major financial hub and employ former diplomats and intelligence officers to track assets and navigate the political nuances of foreign courts. The public perception is that the elite are not just divorcing each other. They are engaging in a form of private statecraft. But as the world grows smaller and the legal systems more interconnected, a new tension is rising. In 2026, the United States is beginning to see a backlash against this jurisdictional arbitrage. There are legislative pushes to make it harder for American citizens to hide behind offshore trusts or foreign decrees. We are seeing a movement toward universal recognition of family law standards, but the progress is slow. The gap between the global citizen and the local resident is widening, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the way they experience the end of a marriage. As we look at the map of the world in 2026, we see that the transnational split is not just a legal loophole. It is the ultimate expression of the inequality of the modern age. It is a world where your rights and your responsibilities are determined by your ability to move your person and your property across a border before the other side catches up. But what happens when the global game is over? What happens when the dust settles and the individuals involved have to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of a multi-year, multi-country war? In the next part of this documentary, we are going to look at the post-divorce reality of 2026. We will examine the rise of the solo economy, the psychological phenomenon of the divorce rebound burnout, and the new social structures that are replacing the traditional family unit in the wake of this global upheaval. We are moving from the high-stakes world of international law into the quiet, often lonely reality of the new normal. Stay with us as we uncover what happens after the final papers are signed, and the world is no longer a game board, but just a place to live. The final signature on a divorce decree in 2026 does not signal the end of a conflict. It signals the beginning of a total structural reorganization of a human life. We often focus on the explosion of the breakup, but the true documentary of the American divorce is written in the silence of the months and years that follow. In the United States today, the public perception of the divorcee has shifted from one of social failure to that of a primary economic unit. We have entered the era of the solo economy, where the marketplace has moved away from the traditional family bundle and toward the individual survivor. To understand this post-divorce reality, we must look at the step-by-step rebuilding of identity, finance, and social belonging in an environment that is increasingly optimized for the single adult, but remains punitively expensive for the solitary. Imagine a man named James living in a revitalized urban district in Charlotte, North Carolina, in 2026. James is 44 years old and 6 months out of a 15-year marriage. In 1990, a man in James's position might have moved into a sparse apartment and disappeared from social view. In 2026, James is greeted by an entire economy designed to monetize his new status. The solo economy is a multi-billion-dollar sector that targets the potential outcomes of a split. James finds himself living in a luxury micro-unit, a space that is half the size of his former suburban home but costs nearly as much. This is the first pillar of the new normal, the privatization of the domestic sphere. The public perception that divorce leads to a simplified life is often contradicted by the data. The cost of living alone in a major U.S. city in 2026 carries what sociologists call the singles tax. James pays more for insurance, more for utilities per square foot, and more for groceries because the supply chain is still heavily skewed toward the family-sized package. We must also examine the psychological phenomenon of the rebound burnout. In 2026, there is an intense societal pressure to perform the perfect recovery. Historical trends show that in the early 2000s people were allowed to grieve. Today, the perception is that you must immediately leverage your divorce into a period of radical self-optimization. James is bombarded with advertisements for divorce retreats, biohacking workshops, and career pivot coaches. The case studies of 2026 reveal a high rate of burnout among the newly single, as they attempt to manage a full-time career, domestic responsibilities, and an aggressive self-improvement regime simultaneously. The narrative of thriving post-divorce has become a mandatory performance. James feels that if he is not at his peak physical and professional state within a year, he is failing at being divorced. This is the hidden labor of the modern split, the requirement to be more productive as an individual than you ever were as part of a pair. This leads to the radical shift in social structures. In the United States of 2026, the nuclear family is no longer the only viable model for long-term stability. We are witnessing the rise of the divorce village. Because the solo economy is so expensive, many Americans are turning to non-romantic cohabitation. James, realizing that his micro-unit is unsustainable, joins a co-living community specifically designed for professionals over 40. This is not a dormitory. It is a sophisticated, managed environment where 3 or 4 individuals share a large, high-end home with private suites and communal living areas. The public perception of these arrangements has moved from being viewed as a desperate measure to being seen as a strategic lifestyle choice. The potential outcomes of the divorce village include shared childcare, pooled resources for domestic labor, and a built-in support network that prevents the isolation historically associated with the end of a marriage. Furthermore, we must look at the role of technology in the rebuilding process. In 2026, the dating market for the newly divorced is governed by AI-driven reputation scores. When James decides to re-enter the dating world, he isn't just uploading a photo. He is integrating his digital history. We see a trend where platforms now allow for a verified single status, which cross-references public records to ensure that a divorce is indeed finalized. However, this also means that James's marital history is a permanent part of his romantic resume. The public perception of baggage has been quantified. Potential partners can see, through subtle AI filtering, whether James has a history of high-conflict litigation or a stable co-parenting relationship. This digital transparency creates a meritocracy of the heart, where your behavior during your divorce determines your value in the post-divorce market. The economic reality of the 2026 solo economy also reveals a fascinating shift in the travel and leisure sector. Historical trends show that vacations were once the domain of the family or the couple. Today, the fastest-growing segment of the American travel industry is the solo divorcee expedition. These are not singles cruises in the traditional sense. They are high-end, immersive experiences designed for personal reflection and skill building. James might spend a week in the desert learning high-performance driving, or in a coastal retreat learning artisanal craftsmanship. The goal is the reclamation of the self. The marketplace has recognized that the divorced adult has more discretionary time and a desperate need for a new narrative. By selling the experience of self-discovery, the industry has turned the trauma of divorce into a recurring revenue stream. However, we cannot ignore the quiet, often lonely reality of the new normal that exists behind the luxury micro-units and the curated expeditions. Case studies of 2026 show that despite the digital connectivity and the co-living options, the sense of displacement remains profound. The American public perception of divorce often skips over the Tuesday nights when the house is empty and the children are at the other parent's residence. The step-by-step process of learning to be alone is one that no app can fully manage. James has to learn to cook for one, to manage a budget that no longer has a secondary cushion, and to face a future that is no longer scripted by a decades-old plan. The resilience of the 2026 divorcee is not found in their ability to thrive on social media, but in their ability to endure the silence of a life that has been fundamentally re-baselined. As we examine James and the millions of Americans like him, we see that the post-divorce reality is the true frontier of the American family. We are moving toward a society where the period after a marriage is as long and as significant as the marriage itself. The solo economy is not a temporary fix. It is a permanent structural change in how the United States operates. We have traded the security of the unit for the autonomy of the individual, and the price of that trade is only now becoming clear. The perception of divorce has moved from an ending to a long, complex middle, where the rules are still being written by the participants. But as this segment of the population grows, it is starting to influence the very institution it left behind. The lessons learned in the solo economy and the divorce village are beginning to change how people think about marriage in the first place. If you can be happy and stable alone, why enter into a legal contract at all? If the post-divorce reality is manageable, does the threat of divorce lose its power as a deterrent? In the final part of this documentary, we are going to synthesize everything we have learned. We will look at the future of the American Union. We will examine the potential outcomes of a society where marriage is a temporary arrangement and the radical new forms of commitment that are emerging to take its place. We are moving from the reality of the now to the horizon of the tomorrow. Stay with us for the conclusion of this deep dive masterclass as we ask the final question. Is marriage in America still worth the risk? The question of whether marriage is still worth the risk in 2026 is being answered not by philosophers or theologians, but by the actuarial tables and risk assessment strategies of a new generation. We are standing at the threshold of a total redefinition of the American Union. To understand where we are going, we have to look at how the public perception of the marriage contract itself is being rewritten from a permanent static bond into a flexible performance-based agreement. In this final part of our deep dive masterclass, we are going to explore the emergence of the renewable marriage, the rise of the marital audit, and the final synthesis of what it means to succeed in the American domestic landscape of the future. Imagine a young professional named Tyler living in a high-density urban center in the American Midwest in 2026. Tyler is 30 years old, financially independent, and currently in a committed relationship of 4 years. When Tyler thinks about marriage, He does not think about the grand, permanent ceremonies of his grandparents' era. Instead, he views marriage through the lens of a venture capital investment. He is looking at the potential outcomes of his partnership with the same scrutiny he applies to his career. In 2026, Tyler's cohort represents the first generation to move toward the concept of the renewable marriage contract. Historical trends indicate that for the last century, marriage was a binary state. You were either in it until death, or you were a failure who sought a divorce. But in 2026, we see a growing legislative and social push for fixed-term marital agreements. Imagine if a marriage license came with a 5-year sunset clause. At the end of that 5-year period, the couple must actively choose to renew the contract, or it simply expires with a pre-negotiated division of assets. This is not about making divorce easier. It is about making the commitment more intentional. The public perception of this model is shifting from it being viewed as cynical to being seen as the ultimate form of honesty. By removing the assumption of forever, the system forces a step-by-step re-evaluation of the relationship's health. The data from early 2026 case studies suggest that couples who engage in these time-bound agreements report lower levels of the complacency that often leads to high-conflict dissolutions. When Tyler considers this model, he sees a path that mitigates the catastrophic financial and emotional risks we have discussed throughout this series. The potential outcomes of a 5-year renewable term are perceived as far more manageable than a lifetime commitment that might end in a decade-long legal battle. We are witnessing the death of the forever narrative and the birth of the milestone narrative. This leads us to the rise of the marital audit. In the United States of 2026, the public perception of a healthy marriage involves a third-party, objective review of the household's functioning. Step 1 of a marital audit involves a comprehensive financial review by a neutral advisor who ensures that both parties remain on equal footing regarding their separate and joint estates. Step 2 is a logistical audit, where the division of household labor is quantified and adjusted to prevent the resentment that historically acts as a primary catalyst for divorce. Step 3 is a psychological assessment performed by an AI-integrated mediator. The goal of the audit is to prevent the divorce entirely by treating the marriage like a high-performance engine that requires regular maintenance. However, if the audit reveals that the union is no longer meeting the needs of the individuals, the public perception in 2026 is that a timely, respectful exit is a greater sign of maturity than a prolonged, unhappy stay. We have reached a point where the successful divorce is being rebranded as a successful life transition. Case studies of these audited marriages show that when the end does come, it is significantly less traumatic for the children and less destructive to the family's net worth. We must also address the economic necessity of the partnership in a 2026 environment where the cost of living continues to outpace individual wage growth. This has created a paradoxical trend. While the emotional perception of marriage is becoming more flexible, the economic perception is becoming more rigid. Many Americans are entering into what sociologists call the financial-only union. These are couples who may have emotionally divorced years ago, but remain legally bound for the sake of housing stability and tax advantages. The public perception of these arrangements has moved away from judgment and toward a pragmatic acceptance. In a world where a single-bedroom apartment in a major city can consume 60% of a median income, the marriage license has become a vital economic survival tool. But what about the children we discussed in Part 3? In 2026, the perception of the child's role in the future of the union is undergoing a radical shift. We are seeing the emergence of the child-centric marriage, where the legal and emotional bond is explicitly centered on the duration of the child's minority. Once the youngest child reaches 18, the marriage is understood to have completed its primary mission. This removes the pressure of the empty nest syndrome, which historically triggered a massive spike in gray divorces. Instead of a crisis, the end of the parenting-focused marriage is viewed as a graduation for the parents. They have successfully executed their contract, and they are now free to pursue individual paths without the stigma of failure. This brings us to the final synthesis. Is marriage in America still worth the risk? The answer in 2026 is yes, but only if the definition of marriage is allowed to evolve. The public has realized that the traditional one-size-fits-all model of the mid-20th century is incompatible with the digital, globalized, and economically volatile reality of the 21st century. The risk is no longer in the divorce itself. The risk is in the outdated expectations we bring to the union. The perception of divorce has moved from being the enemy of the family to being the safety valve that allows the family to survive in a different form. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we see an American public that is more informed, more cautious, and more pragmatic than ever before. We have moved through the era of shame, the era of revolution, the era of the industrial complex, and the era of the algorithmic altar. We are emerging into a period where the individual is no longer willing to sacrifice their long-term stability for a social construct that was designed for a different age. The future of the American Union is one of radical transparency, where the prenuptial agreement is as common as the wedding invite, and where the end of a relationship is handled with the same professional care as its beginning. The documentary of the American Divorce is a story of a society trying to reconcile its need for connection with its demand for autonomy. We have seen how money, law, technology, and geography all play a role in this struggle. But most importantly, we have seen that the way we perceive each other in our most vulnerable moments is the true metric of our progress as a nation. We are a people who still believe in the power of the partnership, even as we perfect the mechanics of the split. But as the traditional structures of the family continue to dissolve and reform, a new question is beginning to haunt the American social landscape. If we are moving toward a world of renewable contracts and milestone marriages, what happens to the concept of the multi-generational legacy? If the family is constantly being reorganized and liquidated, what is left to pass down to the next generation besides data and debt? In our next investigation, we are going to dive into the rise of the post-inheritance society. We will examine how the divorce industrial complex and the solo economy have effectively erased the American middle-class inheritance, and what this means for the future of wealth in the United States. The end of the marriage might just be the beginning of the end of the estate. Stay with us as we open the next chapter of the American story.